Early March 1943, Port Moresby, Papua, New Guinea, the wrench slipped from hands slick with oil as Captain Paul Irvin Gunn studied the altered bomber before him. Inside that aircraft sat something that should never have been built, something that broke every rule printed in the United States Army Air Force manual, something his commanding officer had never officially approved. 8 forward-facing 50-caliber machine guns jutted where once a bombardier's glass nose had been. The B-25 Mitchell, designed as a medium bomber for precision strikes at altitude, had been reborn into something else entirely. A ship shredder, a commerce raider, an outlawed experiment that might either rescue the Pacific theater or put Gunn before a court-martial. What neither he nor anyone else realized was that this unauthorized improvisation, fueled by desperation and rage, would ignite the greatest single disaster the Japanese Navy would endure in the entire Pacific War. The equation of Allied victory in the Southwest Pacific was not being drafted in Washington offices but hammered together in welding bays and maintenance hangars by a 43-year-old maverick waging his own war. The path to this moment had started 2 years before, on December 8, 1941, Manila time. Paul Irvin Gunn, known then to no one as Pappy, stood on Nichols Field watching Japanese bombers calmly erase the American Air Forces in the Philippines. As general manager of the fledgling Philippine Airlines, he had 4 civilian Beech-18 aircraft under his control. Within hours, Major General Louis Brereton had requisitioned them and sworn Gunn in as a captain in the Army Air Corps. What should have been a brief duty assignment became instead a 3-year odyssey of invention, vengeance, and technological upheaval. Gunn was already 42, a retired Navy Chief Petty Officer who had served 2 decades as an enlisted aviator before leaving in December 1939. He had learned to fly in the 1920s, served with the famed Top Hatters Fighter Squadron, and taught at Pensacola Naval Air Station. He knew aircraft to their bolts and rivets, not from manuals, but from years of flying, fixing, and occasionally wrecking them. But on that December day, such knowledge meant little. Gunn had a more urgent problem. His wife, Clara Louise, called Polly by everyone, and their 4 children were still in Manila as Japanese troops pressed closer. His sons, Paul Jr. and Nathan, were teenagers. His daughters, Connie and Julie, much younger. The family's comfortable expatriate life in Manila had vanished overnight. In the frantic weeks that followed, Gunn flew reconnaissance and supply missions over collapsing American defenses. He evaded Japanese fighters, survived being shot down in the jungle, trekked out alive, and climbed straight into another cockpit. On one flight, he earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for piloting an unarmed transport into Bataan to deliver medicine to surrounded U.S. forces. Threading through hostile skies armed only with nerve and skill, yet he could not reach his family. On Christmas Eve 1941, Gunn was ordered to evacuate key personnel to Australia. He drew every dollar of military pay, borrowed money from fellow officers, and planned to fly his family out with him. But the Japanese advance outran him. His family never reached the airfield in time. Gunn faced a choice: abandon them or defy orders. He flew south to Australia because orders were orders, because the war itself demanded it, larger than a single household, for remaining meant either death or capture. Within weeks, on January 20th, 1942, Polly and the children were seized by Japanese troops and taken to the University of Santo Tomas, converted into an internment center for enemy civilians. Something inside Gunn broke when he received that news. The man who continued to fight was no longer the same person who had left Manila. He had abandoned his wife and 4 children into the custody of an enemy infamous for cruelty. Each day they lingered in that camp was a day Gunn could not guard them. The only thing he could do was accelerate the end of the war. If he could not rescue his family directly, he could obliterate every ship, every airplane, every supply route that sustained Japanese forces in the Philippines. This was not sanctioned policy. This was revenge cloaked as invention. When Major General George Kenney arrived in Brisbane in late July 1942, To assume command of the Allied Air Force's Southwest Pacific area, he discovered a calamity. His predecessor had been removed. Morale was abysmal. Equipment was lacking. The Japanese dominated the skies over New Guinea and were menacing Australia itself. General Douglas MacArthur, the theatre commander, had lost faith in his air forces and expressed that view plainly. Kenney was 53, a World War I fighter ace with 2 confirmed victories and a Silver Star. He had instructed at the Air Corps Tactical School and was noted for unorthodox thinking. When MacArthur subjected him to an hour-long diatribe about the failures of Allied air power, Kenney listened respectfully and then requested one thing: authority to dismiss any officer he judged deadwood. MacArthur, taken aback by the demand, consented. Within weeks, Kenney had reorganized his command, bringing in bold younger officers and establishing a forward headquarters in New Guinea. To hasten decisions, he named Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead as his forward commander, empowering him to alter aircraft assignments according to weather and tactical needs, instead of awaiting orders from Brisbane. But personnel shifts meant nothing without capable weapons. Allied bombing from medium and high altitude proved disastrously ineffective against Japanese shipping. High-altitude bombing allowed ships time to evade. The B-17 flying fortresses were scoring on fewer than 1% of targets. Japanese convoys were replenishing their garrisons in New Guinea with impunity. Allied ground units were perishing in the jungle, while fresh Japanese troops poured ashore from transports that bombers could not sink. Kenney had pondered this dilemma since 1928, when he taught at the tactical school. He had conceived skip bombing, releasing bombs at extremely low altitude so they would bounce across the water like stones on a pond, striking the flanks of ships below the waterline, where armor was weakest. The idea was valid. The practice proved arduous. B-17s lacked forward-firing armament. Approaching at mast height meant flying through furious anti-aircraft fire with nothing to silence the gunners. Then Kenney found Paul Gunn, and everything shifted. In August 1942, Kenney discovered that someone in the 3rd Attack Group was altering A-20 Havoc light bombers without authorization. The conversions were crude but effective. Someone had removed the bombardier from the clear nose and fitted 50-caliber machine guns in his stead, all aimed forward. The plan was to strafe Japanese defenses at very low altitude, suppressing ground fire before releasing bombs. Kenney thus permanently altering tactics and boosting Allied prospects across the Southwest Pacific theater. An inquiry revealed Captain Paul Gunn essentially operating alone, salvaging armaments from wrecked fighters and fitting them into attack planes. Gunn had educated himself in aircraft modification through repeated experiments. He lacked a formal engineering diploma, yet he knew aircraft structures, weight balance and weapon systems from 2 decades of hands-on experience. Most officers would have court-martialed Gunn for altering service aircraft without permission. Kenney at once put him on his personal staff as a special projects officer and handed him an almost impossible assignment: convert every A-20 in the theater for low-altitude attack, and do it at once. Gunn put in 18-hour days. He scrounged weapons from crashed planes, fabricated mounting brackets in improvised shops, and personally test-flew each conversion. He installed 4 50-caliber machine guns in the nose of each A-20, added additional guns along the fuselage, and fitted racks for parachute-retarded fragmentation bombs. The modified A-20s went into action in September 1942, striking a Japanese airfield at Buna. The results went beyond expectation. The strafing A-20s came in at treetop level, guns blazing, suppressing anti-aircraft positions before dropping their bombs. Japanese defenders, used to high-altitude bombers they could see coming for minutes, had almost no time to respond. The raid destroyed dozens of aircraft on the ground and proved that low-level strafing could change air warfare. Kenney immediately ordered Gunn to begin a similar conversion program for B-25 Mitchell medium bombers. The B-25 was larger than the A-20, had greater range, carried heavier bomb loads, and could mount more forward-firing weapons. If Gunn could turn the Mitchell into a gunship, it would become the theater's most potent anti-shipping weapon. The B-25 Mitchell had been designed in 1939 as a medium-altitude level bomber. It was a twin-engine airplane with a wingspan of 67 feet 7 inches, powered by two Wright R2600 radial engines producing about 1,700 horsepower each. Normal armament consisted of 6 50-caliber machine guns for defense and up to 3,000 pounds of bombs. It carried a crew of 5, pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, radio operator and gunner. The aircraft was named for General Billy Mitchell, the outspoken advocate of air power who had been court-martialed in 1925 for his blunt criticisms. Roughly 9,190 B-25s would eventually be built at 2 North American aviation plants, one in Inglewood, California, and another in Kansas City, Kansas. The B-25 earned fame in April 1942 when Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25Bs in a daring raid on Tokyo, launched from the carrier USS Hornet. The raid caused little structural damage, but delivered an enormous morale boost to Americans still smarting from Pearl Harbor. Crucially, it forced Japan to keep fighters at home to defend the mainland, rather than send them to distant fronts. Yet the B-25's primary role remained medium-altitude bombing, a mission at which it proved ineffective against ships. Gunn looked at the Mitchell and saw potential no one else did. The nose section was roomy enough to carry multiple heavy machine guns. The twin-engine layout offered redundancy. Losing one engine would not doom the airplane. Its rugged construction could absorb punishment. Most important, the Mitchell had the range to reach Japanese shipping lanes that the shorter-ranged A-20 could not. In late 1942, Gunn began modifying B-25s in a maintenance hangar at Townsville, Australia. He worked alongside Captain Jack Fox of North American Aviation, technical representative in the theater. Fox's job was to ensure factory specifications were followed for modifications. Instead, he became Gunn's co-conspirator in what would grow into the war's most successful unauthorized aircraft conversion program. The initial task was removing the bombardier and his glass nose section. That saved weight and eliminated a vulnerable position useless for low-altitude attack. Gunn replaced the transparent nose with a solid metal housing fitted with 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns, all fixed to fire forward and controlled by the pilot. Each gun carried 500 rounds. The cyclic rate was roughly 850 rounds per minute per gun, allowing the pilot to unleash a torrent of lead that could shred any target in seconds. But 4 guns did not satisfy Gunn. He added 2 more 50s in cheek blisters on either side of the forward fuselage, just below and behind the cockpit. These blister guns projected slightly past the propeller arc, so bullets cleared the propeller disc. They were fixed, forward-firing, and increased the pilot's firepower. Then Gunn took a radical step. The B-25 had a dorsal turret with twin 50-caliber guns behind the cockpit that could rotate to cover attacks from above and astern. Gunn locked that turret facing forward, adding 2 more guns under the pilot's control. The co-pilot could operate them through a cockpit sight, or the pilot could fire all weapons together with a master trigger. The modified B-25 now sported 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, delivering roughly 180 pounds of projectiles per second. By comparison, a single P-51 Mustang carried 4 50-caliber guns. The converted B-25 concentrated the forward firepower of more than one fighter in a platform that still carried 2,000 pounds of bombs. The alterations posed serious engineering problems. Adding mass to the nose shifted the center of gravity forward, making the airplane nose-heavy and harder to handle. Gunn corrected this by moving equipment aft and ballasting the tail. The enormous recoil from 8 guns firing at once induced structural stress. Gunn strengthened the nose with extra bracing. The weapons produced immense heat and smoke. He added ventilation and relocated ammunition to reduce fire risk. Most crucially, Gunn solved gun harmonization. The 8 barrels had to converge at a precise point ahead of the aircraft, typically between 200 and 400 yards. If misaligned, rounds would spray everywhere but the target. Gunn devised a ground testing regimen, using targets at measured distances, adjusting each mount until all 8 weapons converged exactly. He test-fired them himself, making minute tweaks and refusing to sign off on any ship that failed his standard. The full conversion took roughly 2 weeks per aircraft when crews worked non-stop. Gunn trained maintenance teams to carry out the work, instituting production line techniques. By December 1942, he had modified enough B-25s to outfit the 91st Bombardment Squadron. That squadron required a commander who grasped low-altitude attack and would flout orthodox bombing doctrine. Kenney chose Major Ed Lana, a pilot who had risen from first lieutenant to major in weeks because of aggressive combat leadership. Lana had proven exceptional at low-level missions and had earned Kenney's trust. Trung Ti Ding Duan, Trung Ti Di Duan Gunn devised the tactics that would reshape naval combat. The altered B-25s would close on Japanese ships at hair-raisingly low altitudes, sometimes as little as 50 ft above the water. Flying flat out at roughly 300 mph, at that height and speed, they were almost impossible for shipboard gunners to follow. The closing velocity outpaced manual aiming, and by the time gunners began to track the attackers, the aircraft were already past. As the Mitchells bore down, pilots opened up with all 8 forward guns at about 1,000 WWII, walking their fire into the target. The torrent of 50 caliber rounds swept the decks, killing or suppressing anti-aircraft crews, shredding gun emplacements, tearing apart superstructure, and throwing the ship into confusion. The objective was rarely to sink the vessel with gunfire alone, although the damage could be severe. The point was to silence the ship's defenses and terrorize its crew. Then came the bombs. At some 200-400 YD, and at the minimum safe altitude, the pilot released a bomb fitted with a 4 to 5 second delayed fuse. Leaving the aircraft at 300 mm, the bomb struck the water and skipped across the surface, bouncing once or twice before striking the ship's side at or below the waterline. The delayed fuse prevented a surface detonation. Instead, the bomb punched into the hull, sank slightly beneath the surface, and then exploded. The detonation struck the most vulnerable area below the armor belt, where plating was thinnest. The blast was magnified by the water's incompressibility, which transmitted shock waves with devastating force. A single underwater explosion could buckle a keel, rupture fuel tanks, flood engine compartments, and precipitate catastrophic structural failure. By the time the charge went off, the B-25 was already past the target, climbing sharply to escape the blast and any secondary detonations. From first tracer to bomb release, the whole attack lasted on the order of 10 seconds. Skip bombing was not wholly novel. The British had tried the method, and some American airmen had experimented independently, but combining skip bombing with overwhelming forward firepower was Gunn's innovation. The strafer nose turned the bomber into its own fighter escort, suppressing defenses before the bomb run. The pairing proved lethal. While Gunn altered aircraft, Allied intelligence was tracking Japanese naval movements. Ultra-intercepts, the code-breaking operation that had cracked Japanese naval ciphers, supplied detailed enemy plans. Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, known as FREL, was reading Japanese traffic almost in real time. In late February 1943, FREL intercepted messages indicating a major Japanese convoy was assembling at Rabaul on New Britain. The convoy's destination lay along New Guinea's northern coast. The cargo was troops and supplies for Japanese forces resisting Allied advances in Papua. The intelligence was explicit. 8 transports would carry roughly 6,900 troops of the 51st Division. 8 destroyers would escort them. The convoy would sail from Rabaul at midnight on February 28, 1943, and reach the Labe area about 3 days later. This was Japan's maximum reinforcement effort for New Guinea. If it reached shore, Japanese strength would be greatly increased, and Allied momentum might halt. If it failed, Japan would lose thousands of experienced soldiers and likely never attempt such a large seaborne reinforcement again. General Kenney saw a chance to test his modified aircraft and the new tactics aimed at the single most important target since Pearl Harbor. He gathered every available aircraft in the theater for a coordinated strike. The force would include B-17 Flying Fortresses bombing from medium altitude, Royal Australian Air Force bow fighters strafing at low level, P-38 Lightning fighters providing cover, and modified B-25 strafers performing skip bombing runs. It would be the largest coordinated air operation in the Southwest Pacific to date. Kenney personally briefed squadron commanders on February 28th. The orders were blunt. Find the convoy. Attack without mercy. Give no quarter. Sink every ship. This was not a raid. This was annihilation. At midnight on February 28, 1943, the Japanese convoy put to sea from Simpson Harbor at Rabaul. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura flew his flag in the destroyer Shirayuki. The convoy comprised 8 transports: Kyokoma Maru, Kambumaru, Teyomaru, Nojimaru, Ayomaru, Tamaru, Shinmaru, and Droawa Maru, escorted by 8 destroyers: Shirayuki, Asashio, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Uranami, Shikinami, and Asagumo. Some 100 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters were assigned as air cover for the voyage. It was the strongest resupply force Japan had committed to New Guinea. Kimura expected losses. Every previous convoy had been damaged, yet Japanese commanders believed enough ships would survive to deliver the reinforcements. They were wrong. That afternoon, a B-24 Liberator on patrol sighted the convoy and radioed position, course, and composition. Kenney's command immediately launched reconnaissance to shadow the group. Weather initially favored the Japanese. 2 tropical storms swept the area, cloaking the convoy in clouds and cutting visibility. Allied aircraft kept contact but could not press effective attacks through the storms. The convoy made steady progress at about 7 knots, roughly 8 miles per hour, constrained by the heavily laden transports. The destroyers could have steamed at 20 knots or more, but had to match the convoy's slow pace. By nightfall on March 1st, the ships had covered roughly 90 miles, about halfway to Leh. Deteriorating weather was welcomed by Kimura. Poor conditions meant fewer Allied aircraft, but also produced heavy seas that battered the transports and left troops below decks suffering from severe seasickness. On the morning of March 2, 1943, conditions improved and Allied reconnaissance regained visual contact. At about 10 a.m., 29 B-17 Flying Fortresses struck from 5,000 feet. The high-altitude bombing was predictably ineffective. The B-17s claimed hits, but Japanese records show minimal damage. Perhaps one transport was slightly damaged. The attack did force the convoy to alter course repeatedly, slowing its progress toward Leh. Through March 2nd, additional B-17 strikes continued, dropping dozens of bombs from varying altitudes. Ships maneuvered wildly, and Japanese fighters engaged the bombers. Several B-17s were damaged, and 3 Japanese fighters were shot down, but no transports sank. The high-altitude raids harassed the convoy, but did not stop it. As night fell on March 2nd, Kenney knew the decisive strike would come the following morning. The modified B-25s were ready. Major Lana had briefed his crews repeatedly. They had rehearsed the attack profile over a wrecked hulk on February 28th, using combined formations of B-17s, B-25s, P-38s, and bow fighters. Every pilot knew the mission. The skip bombing runs had been rehearsed. The strafer guns were harmonized. The ordnance was loaded. The point of no return was near. At dawn on March 3, 1943, weather favored attack. Clear skies, sharp visibility, calm seas. Rear Admiral Kimura may have felt a premonition. His convoy lay about 30 miles from Leh, close enough for land-based anti-aircraft fire to assist, yet still exposed. At Cape Ward Hunt on Papua's northern coast, the Allied strike assembled. Roughly 90 aircraft converged. B-17 flying fortresses, modified B-25 strafers, RAF bow fighters, and P-38 Lightning escorts. They would strike in waves from different directions throughout the day. At 10 a.m., the assault began. The B-17 struck first from medium altitude, diverting attention and forcing evasive maneuvers. Then the low-level aircraft arrived. Bowfighters opened fire with 4 20mm cannon and 6 machine guns, suppressing anti-aircraft batteries. The destroyers answered with everything, but the closing speed was too great. Then came the B-25 strafers and the slaughter. Wave after wave tore into the convoy. One pilot lined up on Kyokusei Maru, dropping to 50 feet above the sea. At 1,000 yards, he opened fire. 8 50-caliber guns, 6,800 rounds per minute, 180 pounds of steel per second, chewed into the transport. Tracer lines walked across the decks, mowing sailors, smashing gun mounts, ripping the bridge apart. Shards of metal sprayed everywhere. Then he dropped 2 500-pound bombs with delayed fuses. They skipped once on the surface and smashed below the waterline amidships. Seconds later, 2 thunderous underwater blasts ripped her bottom out. Kyokusei Maru heeled hard to port, flooding rapidly. She went down within 15 minutes. Other B-25s followed in succession, each pilot picking a target. Guns blazing, bombs skipping, ships erupting. Maru was struck by at least 3 B-25s. Gunfire wiped out her deck crews. 4 bombs ripped through the hull. She split in half and sank in under 10 minutes. Teo Maru was strafed so ferociously that fires spread across her superstructure. 2 bombs smashed her hull open, and she went down with nearly 1,000 troops aboard. Nojima tried to dodge but was sluggish. A B-25 raked her stern to bow, then planted 2 bombs in her engine room. Power failed. Flooding began. She would sink later. Meanwhile, bow fighters and B-25s struck the destroyers. Shirayuki, Admiral Kimura's flagship, was shredded by strafing that killed nearly all on the bridge. Kimura himself was wounded. A bomb near the stern set off a magazine. Secondary blasts blew her aft section apart, and she sank. Tokitsukaze was hit squarely. Bomb strikes ignited her fuel tanks. The destroyer turned into a raging inferno and sank within the hour. Arashio rammed the transport Nojima, while evasive maneuvers were attempted and suffered crippling damage. The destroyer was abandoned and went down. Throughout the assault, Japanese A-6M-0 fighters fought desperately to shield the convoy, but P-38 Lightnings engaged them at altitude, while the B-25s attacked at masthead height, where fighters could not safely press in without endangering their own ships. The coordination was flawless. The strike lasted roughly 40 minutes. When Allied aircraft broke off to rearm and refuel, the scene was apocalyptic. 4 transports were sinking or already gone. 3 destroyers had been lost. The remaining vessels were scattered and damaged. Chaos reigned. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers and sailors floated in the water. Corpses drifted among wreckage. Burning oil slicked the sea. That afternoon, Allied planes returned for follow-up strikes. Modified B-25s located the crippled ships limping toward Leh. The attacks were relentless and merciless. Each vessel was singled out. The strafer B-25s dove in low, guns spitting, bombs skipping. More transports went down. The destroyer Asashio, already hit, took further blows and sank. By nightfall on March 3rd, all 8 transports and 4 of the 8 destroyers had been destroyed. An estimated 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were dead or drowning. About 2,700 were plucked from the water by the 4 surviving destroyers and by submarines dispatched from Rabaul. Only around 200 troops would eventually reach Leh, many without weapons or equipment. Of the 6,900 troops originally embarked, more than 5,700 were casualties. The convoy had been annihilated. Allied losses were remarkably light. 1 B-17 Flying Fortress was lost. 3 P-38 fighters were destroyed in combat. 13 aircrew were killed. Compared with Japanese losses, it was scarcely more than a skirmish. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, as it came to be known, was a turning point in the Pacific War. It proved conclusively that land-based air power could obliterate a heavily escorted naval convoy. It validated skip bombing when paired with overwhelming forward firepower. It vindicated every modification Gunn had made to the B-25. Most significantly, it convinced Japan that resupplying New Guinea by sea was no longer practicable. Never again would Japan risk a major reinforcement convoy to New Guinea. Japanese forces there would slowly starve and wither as supplies dwindled. General MacArthur issued a communique claiming 22 ships sunk, including 3 cruisers and 7 destroyers, and more than 12,000 troops killed. The real figures were lower, though still catastrophic. Wartime exaggeration was typical. What mattered was the strategic effect. Kenney had shown his concepts worked. Skip bombing was viable, modified bombers were effective, and low-altitude attacks could succeed despite heavy defenses. Paul Gunn, watching reports arrive in Australia, must have felt a grim satisfaction. His modifications had destroyed a Japanese convoy. His aircraft had killed thousands of enemy troops. Yet his family still remained in Santo Tomas, and the war was far from over. The success at the Bismarck Sea prompted rapid expansion of the conversion program. Kenney ordered every available B-25 in the theater transformed into strafers. Gunn redoubled his efforts, training more crews, refining techniques, and scaling production. By mid-1943, most B-25s in the Southwest Pacific had been modified. North American aviation took notice. Company representatives visited Gunn's workshops, examined the field modifications, and requested detailed specifications. The manufacturer wanted to fold Gunn's innovations into factory production, was elevated to major, and sent back to the United States to collaborate with North American aviation at both the Englewood and Kansas City factories. He spent much of 1943 and early 1944 working side by side with engineers to create factory-built strafer variants of the B-25. The first result was the B-25G, which mounted a 75mm cannon in the nose alongside 4 50-caliber machine guns. A total of 405 B-25Gs were built. The 75mm gun fired a 14.7-pound shell capable of piercing ship armor or smashing fortified bunkers. Yet the weapon was cumbersome, slow to reload, and required a crewman in the nose to handle shells. Gunn tested the B-25G in combat himself, leading a 3rd attack group raid on a Japanese destroyer. His cannon shot crippled the ship's fire control, leaving it unable to coordinate weapons. Conventional bombs ultimately sent it to the bottom. Gunn publicly claimed the cannon had sunk the destroyer, though privately he admitted the bombs did the real work. The B-25H followed, incorporating both the 75mm cannon and an astonishing array of 14 50-caliber guns in different mounts. About 1,000 B-25Hs were produced. The dorsal turret was shifted forward and the co-pilot's seat removed to save weight, leaving the navigator to assist with cannon loading. This tremendous firepower came at a cost. The H model was nose-heavy and tricky to fly. Wright Field, the Army Air Force's main test center, warned Gunn that the imbalance was unsafe and urged grounding the type until corrected. Legend claims Gunn fired back with the remark, "Put center of gravity in storage for the duration. We have a war to fight." True or not, the story reflected his priorities. Combat usefulness outweighed engineering niceties. Pilots simply learned to adapt. The final mass-produced model, the B-25J, restored a bombardier's glass nose on some aircraft, but retained strafer noses on others. A total of 4,318 J models were manufactured, making it the most common version. Certain B-25Js carried as many as 8 forward-firing nose guns, 4 in cheek blisters, 2 in the top turret, and 4 mounted in waist positions. Altogether, firepower could reach 1850 caliber weapons, making it the most heavily armed bomber of World War II. Such destructive capacity was rarely required, but the psychological effect was immense. Japanese troops quickly learned to dread the thunder of Mitchell engines, a sound that heralded death from the skies. All through 1943 and 1944, Gunn's modified B-25s laid waste to Japanese targets across the Pacific. In August 1943, strafers struck Japanese airfields at WWII in New Guinea, wiping out 174 planes on the ground and crippling Japanese air strength in the theater. The WWII attacks were possible only because Gunn had solved the problem of extended range. Standard B-25s barely reached the area, so he devised a system of auxiliary tanks placed in the bomb bay. Crews drained the fuel, then shoved the empty tanks out through an open hatch. Though crude, fumes filled the cabin and wind whistled through. The system stretched range by several hundred miles. With Japanese air power broken, Allied ground forces advanced almost unopposed. In November 1943, B-25 strafers struck Rabaul Harbor in one of the war's most dramatic raids. Major Raymond "Jock" Hennebrey led 38 B-25s against heavily defended shipping, flying at masthead height, with P-38 Lightnings providing top cover and phosphorus bombs. Smoke screens. Of the 38 vessels in harbor, 30 sustained direct hits. One heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and many transports and auxiliaries were sunk or crippled. The strike neutralized Rabaul as an advanced base and proved that even Japan's strongest fortifications could fall to modified B-25s. During the Philippines campaign of 1944, B-25 strafers gave close air support to ground troops, cut Japanese supply lines, and hammered shipping across the islands. The planes earned the nickname "Bat Out of Hell" because they struck so low and swiftly, defenders could not react in time. Gunn's modified Mitchells were not the sole weapons winning the Pacific, but they ranked among the most decisive. They sank hundreds of ships, destroyed thousands of aircraft on the ground, and killed tens of thousands of enemy troops. They enabled MacArthur's island-hopping drive by cutting off Japanese garrisons. They secured Allied air superiority, making landings feasible. Gunn's personal ordeal continued at the same time. His family was still imprisoned in Santo Tomas. Letters reached him at times through the Red Cross, though rare and censored. He knew conditions worsened steadily. Guards grew crueler as the war soured, food dwindled, and disease spread. Gunn's only answer was to fight harder, hoping each raid brought victory nearer. In late 1944, U.S. forces invaded Leyte in the Philippines. Gunn was there, still flying missions at 45, still seeking ways to inflict greater damage. One night that year, Japanese bombers struck Tacloban airfield on Leyte. White phosphorus bombs erupted nearby. Shrapnel ripped into Gunn's shoulder, wrecking his right arm and causing terrible pain. Evacuated to Australia, he spent months in recovery. The wound ended his combat flying, but the war itself was nearing its end. On February 3, 1945, spearhead elements of the 1st Cavalry Division, driving as a flying column, liberated Santo Tomas camp in Manila. The troopers arrived just as Japanese guards prepared to execute leaders of the internees. Amid the chaos of Manila's street battles, more than 4,000 prisoners were freed. Among them were Polly and her 4 children. They had endured 3 years and 14 days of captivity. Emaciated, scarred, but alive, they were saved. MacArthur himself visited the camp soon after and met the Gunn family. He arranged for them to be flown south to Australia for reunion. Weeks later, after more than 3 years, Gunn embraced his family again. Polly had kept the children safe against impossible odds. The boys, grown older, had survived separation from the women. The girls endured years of hunger and hardship. Though together again, they were no longer who they had been. The war had marked them all. After recovering from his injuries, Gunn stayed with the Army Air Forces. He advanced to lieutenant colonel and continued developing tactics and modifications, though no longer in combat cockpits. On June 30, 1948, he retired from service as a full colonel, medically discharged due to his wounds. His awards included the Distinguished Flying Cross with 1 oak leaf cluster, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Air Medal, 9 Purple Hearts, and numerous other decorations, unit citations, and campaign ribbons. His 9 Purple Hearts marked 9 separate times he was wounded or injured in combat. After the war, Gunn returned to the Philippines and revived Philippine Airlines. The nation was rebuilding from occupation and the devastation of liberation, and Gunn helped restore vital air transport, reconnecting islands long isolated. He was still flying, still taking risks, still pushing limits. On October 11, 1957, just a week before his 58th birthday, Gunn piloted a charter flight that ran into a violent storm. The plane went down. Paul Irvin "Pappy" Gunn died as he had lived nearly 4 decades, flying. He was laid to rest at Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station, Pensacola, Florida, where he had once served as an instructor. His legacy endured in many forms. The B-25 strafer modifications he pioneered remained standard throughout the conflict. Roughly 9,890 B-25 Mitchells were built, with thousands altered as strafers using Gunn's designs. The skip bombing methods he refined destroyed hundreds of Japanese vessels and played a decisive role in the Pacific victory. Gunn proved that battlefield innovation could emerge from unlikely places, even from a grieving father's workshop. Military authorities had wanted to fight with existing hardware and sanctioned tactics. Gunn showed necessity demanded new solutions. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became a case study worldwide. Intelligence, coordination, novel weapons, and bold tactics produced a total victory at minimal cost. 8 transports lost, 4 destroyers sunk, more than 5,000 Japanese killed, for only 4 Allied aircraft. The calculus was stark. You could not survive without control of the skies. Each ship sunk meant missions never flown, soldiers never fighting, ammunition never fired. Striking supplies before they reached combat proved the most efficient form of war. The modified B-25 made it possible. It could fly hundreds of miles, overwhelm defenses with massed guns, skip bomb ships into destruction, and return for another mission. One B-25 strafer achieved what once demanded many aircraft types in concert. Japan learned the lesson too late. After Bismarck Sea, they no longer risked major daylight convoys within Allied range. Instead, they shifted to night sailings, relied on submarines for critical cargo, and turned to small barges hugging coastlines by day. Losses shrank but never ceased. B-25s hunted barges with equal lethality, while radar-equipped Mitchells prowled night seas. No time was safe, no route secure, no haven possible for Japanese logistics in the Southwest Pacific. Month by month, the chokehold tightened until isolated garrisons withered. In New Guinea, the Philippines, and across the islands, Japanese forces fought on with dwindling rations and no hope of relief, reinforcement. They were brave, determined, and doomed. Air supremacy, delivered by weapons like the modified B-25, rendered their courage irrelevant. By 1945, the modified B-25 had become the standard anti-shipping aircraft in the Pacific. The design evolved with the B-25G, H and J variants, each carrying heavier armament. But the essential idea remained Gunn's first innovation, a medium bomber converted into a flying gunship capable of suppressing defenses and delivering devastating low-level strikes. When the war ended in August 1945, modified B-25s were still flying combat sorties. They were among the planes that escorted the Japanese surrender mission from Tokyo to Manila that month. Fittingly, the aircraft that had crippled Japan's supply lines witnessed its capitulation. Post-war studies by American and Japanese analysts confirmed the importance of Gunn's work. Japanese officers admitted that after the Bismarck Sea disaster, they realized convoys were no longer safe within Allied air reach. The psychological blow equaled the physical destruction. Commanders knew low-flying strafers could arrive without warning and wipe out entire formations before defenses could respond. Modified B-25s created a new style of warfare, where medium bombers hunted ships with the lethality of submarines and the firepower of cruisers. The lessons spread beyond the Pacific. Air forces worldwide examined skip bombing and forward-firing gun systems. The later AC-47, AC-119, and AC-130 gunships in Vietnam and beyond were direct heirs to Gunn's Mitchells. Out of 9,090 B-25s produced during the war, Over 100 still exist, most in the US. Many remain airworthy, flying at air shows where their size, sound, and history awe spectators. The rumble of twin-right R-2600 engines is unforgettable. A B-25 sweeping low across a field evokes the terror they inspired as they skimmed above Japanese ships. Some restored aircraft are fitted as strafers, their nose guns firing blanks for demonstrations. The flashes, roar, and shudder of recoil offer a glimpse of what enemy sailors faced in their final moments. Museums across the world preserve B-25s. The National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, displays several. The Naval Aviation Museum at Pensacola, where Gunn once taught, also holds one. The Smithsonian Air and Space Museum ensures the legacy is remembered. Each aircraft embodies innovation, necessity, and victory. In 1959, General George Kenney published The Saga of Pappy Gunn, a biography of the man whose ingenuity helped change the war. Retired by then, Kenney sought to preserve Gunn's legacy. The book described his modifications, combat flights, and personal fight for his family. Kenney wrote that Gunn was among the most important figures in the Pacific Campaign, a man whose unauthorized changes saved countless lives and shortened the conflict. Nathaniel Gunn, Pappy's youngest son, later added his perspective. His writings told the family's side, life inside Santo Tomas, and the long wait for freedom. Together, the Gunn family's ordeal became an example of sacrifice and resilience. In 1975, the U.S. Air Force posthumously honored Gunn by naming a training facility after him. The recognition was long overdue, but deeply deserved. Gunn had not sought fame. He sought effectiveness. His story endures as proof of how unauthorized modifications produced a devastating weapon system. Gunn would not accept his family's captivity as unchangeable. He would not accept that the standard aircraft were sufficient. He would not accept regulations that blocked innovation. That refusal, coupled with his skill and Kenney's support, created modifications that reshaped warfare. The B-25 strafer sank hundreds of ships, destroyed thousands of aircraft on the ground, and killed tens of thousands of enemy troops. It gave MacArthur's forces the edge they needed. The modified B-25 was not the sole weapon that won the global war. Victory came from millions of people, countless weapons, and 4 years of effort. But the strafer delivered outsized impact compared to its numbers. It embodied what happened when necessity met opportunity, when one man's determination aligned with military needs, when failure was not an option. Born in a maintenance hangar from desperation, it flew into battle at mast-top height, guns hammering, bombs skipping into hulls to erupt beneath the waterline. It broke Japan's supply chain. It hastened the end of the war. It saved Allied lives, and it freed one family after 3 long years of imprisonment, which had been the point all along.